This is Timeline or Time Track Part 2. The point I'd like to raise here relates a great deal to my experiences, my direct experiences with John Grinder at different points in his development and my development and the development of the culture. The point I would like to raise at this juncture is that when I first encountered John in 1983-84, roughly, he was a different man, and he was doing very different stuff. In some ways, his personality and his approach and his interest have remained remarkably consistent over, say, the 30 years that I've known him or been aware of it. And in some ways, there have been equally marked and very significant changes in his focus and his interest, his language, his technique, his method. And it's been fascinating because there were long periods on the timeline where I was not really interested in or following what he was doing, and there were other periods early on and fairly recently. So there's sort of a big chunk taken out of the middle of my timeline vis-a-vis John Grinder, and a lot of early stuff. So I have sort of two Johns. I have two very clearly, strongly developed pictures and thought models of who he is, what he's aiming for, how his work works, what he's attempting to achieve, etc. And fascinatingly, the early Tony Robbins was very much affected dramatically and specifically by the earlier John Grinder. So, to my knowledge, my understanding is that John and Tony, I think Tony did like a practitioner training with John. I'm not clear about exactly what happened. And then Tony was using a lot of John's mannerisms and ideas. One of the ideas that I think kind of came out of, this is a very speculative presumption, but my memory serves the concept of the ritual, and where I'm going with this, my little goal, the outcome I'm moving toward, is how we use rituals, what kind of technique and what kind of development we get through the use of ritual. My memory is that back in the early 80s, John was talking a lot about ritual and how to use ritual and ritualizing, and what parts of one's practice and thought did one ritualize, and how did one use ritual in a productive and generative way. That's another term. You know, we at the early NLP we used the term generativity quite a bit. You just don't hear that much anymore. Back then there was a distinction between therapy and generativity. And the idea was that psychologists had taken on this idea of doing therapy, and they had neglected or had no real model for doing generative work. And NLP had broken with therapy by saying, well, why not use psychology in a generative way? What happens if a healthy person comes to a psychologist and asks to do something better? So that was a question. And recall, if you go back a little teeny bit on your timeline, the great emphasis of placing on questions. So NLP asked itself, I don't know, John or Richard or both or Hal, this very basic question. What would happen if a normal, healthy person went to a psychologist and said, I want to do things better? How do we do some generativity? And psychologists had no answer for that. They didn't know how to take someone who was healthy and normal and make them more effective and better. So that kind of question, I believe, if you started with people like Virginia Satir, Milton Erickson, Fritz Perls, whoever, were taking people that were ailing and wished to be brought up to normal, the question that seemed to have occupied John and Richard back then was, how do I go from normal to better than normal? How do I get out on the right end of the bell curve where the standard deviation, the second or third standard deviation from the mean performance is discovered? In my memory, as I have framed that thing in my mind, and other people may have other frames or readings of that situation, but I think that's what happened. So, in my memory, and my memory of John, and my memory of the John who was specific to the 1980s, the question was, how does one use ritual? What sorts of rituals can one engage in to function in a generative way, auto-generativity? How does one become generative towards one's own behavior through the use of ritual? So I will take that up a little bit more later. I think that's enough at this point.